Now, when you open an Excel file that contains a pivot table looking at external data, the first time you open it, you'll be presented with this little yellow information box that says external data connections have been disabled. Unfortunately, that means you're not bringing through the latest data, so you would always need to enable the content. Now, what you'll find is once you've enabled the content on one machine and saved your changes, there will be no need to re-enable that content. It will then be enabled. To then refresh, we simply right-click and refresh as we have done previously, and it will go to the server and bring down the latest data. Now, unfortunately, it will ask us for the password, which I know is one train, and you know is one train. But it would be quite useful if we didn't have to keep typing that in every time, if we could save the password with the file. So let's say OK. And you can see there in the status bar, it's connected and it's reading the data and it's pulling through the records. And it's updated if required. Now, when it comes to the SQL connection, this is managed through data and connections. And we see our connection here, and we can go into the properties. Now, visiting the properties, one thing you might want to control here is how often the data actually gets refreshed, because we know from previously that a pivot table does not automatically refresh itself when the data changes. We can ask it to refresh on a frequency that you determine in minutes whilst the file is open. So if you have this file open a lot and you're doing a lot of work, then you might want this to refresh really quite frequently. Or you could just say, let's refresh the data when we open the file. So every time I open the file, it will go and get the latest information. Naturally, one will use resources more than the other, and it really depends on how live the data needs to be in your Excel pivot table. Now, under the definition, we can control whether it saves the password. If I place a little tick here to save password, it warns us that it'll be in plain text, making it less secure. That's fine. But what it does do is then add the password into the connection string. We can see it here, password equals one train, which means that in future, we won't need to enter that password every time the file refreshes. That's just for this Excel file. OK, close. So the changes I've made in the connection string properties now affect the data. So we're going to be refreshed every time we open, and we're not going to be required to retype the password in every time the file opens effectively, because that's when the data will be refreshed. That really is the only change that would need to be made for this to now operate as we've seen previously with all the options that we would want in a pivot table. So all the grouping, all the sorting, all the multiple grouping, sublevels, etc. that you would want to have in your pivot table.